Welcome, welcome. Welcome to Plato's Pod. Today is May 2, 2021, Sunday. Discussion that we meet to learn and be even more excited, hopefully, about today's subject. This podcast is audio recording of a live meetup group discussion. We meet through Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, Online Rebels. I'm Eva Ellis. I'll be coordinating this episode. James Myers will be managing discussion today. Hi, James.
Good morning, Eva. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And I'm excited. How are you?
Good, thanks. Yeah, I am excited to discuss today's session. I mean, it's an exciting and long thought-after topic, this question of whether Atlantis existed. And I'd like to get into that question to start off with today's session. But I think it's also an exciting session because I think I have the opportunity here to pick up on themes from several of the other dialogues that we have just recently discussed, including the Timaeus, which I keep going back to. But Atlantis is talked about at the beginning of the Timaeus. So that's kind of where it's introduced. And then the Critias, which we're discussing today, is kind of the continuation of the Timaeus. So we'll have a chance maybe to delve into some of the themes again that Plato discussed in the Timaeus and that we discussed. And then I think also, Phaedrus, that we will have a chance maybe to go back to some of those themes, because in the Critias, Plato does talk about communication, and the Phaedrus was all about communication. And so I think we will be able to touch on some of those themes there. So I wanted to welcome everyone to this morning's session. It's great to see a number of people returning, participating again. And it's also wonderful to see some new faces and voices joining us today. I think, there's no right or wrong answers with Plato. I think it's really what we make of it, of what he says. And it's what we make of our own dialogue. And so I think we have a chance here to find out some new things. And I found in the past discussions that I've had a chance to learn things that I did not know before. And this was knowledge that was brought to us by the other participants. And so I think every session we learn something new. And that's the advantage, I think, of the podcasting that we do, that we have a chance to go back and re-listen to the discussion. And so I think that's a chance to expand our knowledge. So those who haven't listened to the podcast episodes that went before this, they are on rss.com/podcast/PlatosPod. Invite you to take a listen to those and to share it to anybody who you think might be interested. I think it's the whole point of Plato is to spread the effects and the knowledge that's derived in dialogue. So that's great to know that we can do that. And so just before we start, just a few housekeeping items. As Eva said at the beginning, we'll use the raise hands function. If you'd like to speak, that's great. And I'll take the speakers in the order that the hands are raised, but I'll give preference to people who haven't spoken before, so that everybody has a chance to speak, hopefully at least once. And then also, just to let you know, for our next session, I thought we would get into the Euthyphro. It's a short dialogue, but I think actually the themes of the Euthyphro really kind of follow well in Critias. I hadn't expected that. I hadn't read Euthyphro before yesterday, actually. So I found in it actually a kind of an interesting continuation of the themes that we'll discuss here today. So without further ado, I thought I would just start the discussion today by asking everybody, why do you think that the story of Atlantis has been so riveting for so many hundreds and thousands of years since Plato wrote it? So we're, about 2,400 years post-Plato. And then the story of Atlantis apparently took place 9,600 years before Plato. So it was a story that was related through Plato's family, through his relative Solon, who kind of wrote the constitution for Athens. And Solon, I think, was a few hundred years before Plato. So somebody put the timeline at approximately 9,600 years before Plato. So we have this story of this rather fantastic civilization that may have existed, may not have existed. There's debate on that. And, I think it's gripped people for eons. There are people who are, spend all of their lives looking for Atlantis. So the screen image behind me is an artist's rendering of Atlantis. And it's based on the rather precise descriptions that Plato provides in the Critias. Plato provides numbers and ratios. He talks about Atlantis being an island with these concentric rings. He talks about the canals. And so this is an artist's rendering of Atlantis. But I just wanted to put the question to everybody. What do you think it is that grips us so much with the story of Atlantis? And if we were to prove that Atlantis actually existed, why would it make a difference? Just wondering what people think. And feel free to use the raised hands feature. I just kind of like to do a little bit of a roundtable on that question. Did Atlantis exist? It's a question I think that Nuri asked before we started recording what I think. All right, Anthony, hello.
I have a question. Is this question about finding about science?
The question about science in terms of how we would find the existence of Atlantis, or what kind of science we would apply to understand whether it existed or not? Or
yes, that's that one.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, how do we apply science to find the existence of these supposed ancient civilizations? And how do we understand science in the context of how these civilizations would be built? For example, the screen image behind me, there would be a lot of science that would have gone into building this ancient civilization of Atlantis. And so then the question is, did that science exist 9,600 years before Plato? It's a good question. What do others think about that? Is it possible?
It's probably possible, what I think.
And I think it goes to a question of understanding of maybe the path that science takes over time. Does science take a linear path over time? In other words, do we always build on previous knowledge to arrive at where we are now? So is where we are now, is that the pinnacle or the peak of science, or has other science existed that has been lost over time? I don't know if anybody had a chance to go back and read the beginning of the Timaeus. At the beginning of the Timaeus, Plato writes about Deucalion and these other sorts of disasters that wiped out civilization a number of times. Floods and fires, he discusses specifically at the beginning of the Timaeus. And we know, for example, that there was an ice age. And the ice age, was when the planet flooded and then froze. We know that there was a asteroid strike off Chicxulub, Mexico. I think it was around 200 million years ago, reputed to have destroyed the dinosaurs. We can see geological evidence of that. So we have the science that tells us these things happen. And we know that, for example, that asteroid strike off Chicxulub would have created a fireball that would have destroyed almost all of the planet. So we have these scientific things, but we don't necessarily know what existed before. And I think Plato talks about that right at the beginning of the Timaeus. And then he says, actually, at Timaeus 23b, after these events, you become infants all over again, as it were, completely unfamiliar with anything that was in ancient times. So he makes that statement. So thanks for raising that question. And we'll go to Greg and then Moshe. Greg?
Okay. Did you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Anyway, I just want to put forward my kind of view regarding your question about whether it's there's some truth or Atlantic exists or not. When I'm reading it, I certainly feel it's a fantastic story, but I more feel like it's a sort of a utopian kind of description of that time. It's more about Plato's wishes, Plato's think that what could civilization be in ancient time, in the context of his writing regarding the Republic and other dialogues that he portrayed, what could an ideal society be? And basically, he used his lineage as a salon to be the credible source to give us account to add to the believability, if you would say, but also Salon relying heavily on the Egyptians' account of what in the past, because Egyptians, being the oldest civilization, they obviously would know. But if you think really in today's understanding what that time people know about it, is really that's still quite a primitive time in terms of the ability of people to know the past. So people writing was only existing for 400 years, and before that was oral lineage and oral tradition, and there might be some kind of truth, as you can say that the the Homic poems, the stories talk about the fight between the Greece and the other nations in the east coast of Turkey, and that there's some, and later on they indeed. But I think this maybe have some kind of something like that. But certainly the way described is probably out of proportion. And but also, how could they know that something existed so long ago, 9,000 years? There's no way for them to track, and we know couldn't. And also another way to say it is, given the level of civilization they have, it's inconceivable that 9,000 years ago something that would exist in isolation. And that my view is probably have some kind of earlier civilization like Egypt exists in somewhere in Atlantic. People don't know about it, but definitely A, it's not that long, and B, maybe it was a lot of kind of imagination regarding the level of civilization. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Well, thank you, and I think you raise some interesting points about whether there's allegory, whether things are out of proportion, and then the very good question about how these memories are made, especially as Plato has said in Timaeus, that memories are lost and we become as children. And so how did these Egyptian priests who told Solon this story in Timaeus, how did these Egyptian priests know these things? How was that memory preserved? And if that memory was preserved, when we think back to what we heard in Phaedrus, that dialogue about communication, if that memory is preserved, how do we know that that memory is preserved accurately? Because we know that over time, some facts get lost, other facts get added, assumptions get added in, all of these things that I think we naturally do over time, right? So, in fact, with this story of Atlantis, there was, again, referring to that Ancient Greece Declassified podcast episode that I linked in the meetup notice, the writer of the book indicated that there was a U.S. congressman in the 1800s named Ignatius Donnelly who added on to the Atlantis story, embellished the Atlantis story by saying that this was a highly technologically advanced civilization. We maybe see some suggestions of that in Plato's rendition. They had these fantastic walls of silver and all sorts of interesting metals. How did they do that? But that story got really embellished, and so a whole thread of thinking came along that that maybe this was some sort of otherworldly advanced technological civilization. Well, again, we don't know, but this is what happens over time when memories get lost and confused. So it's a good question. Moshe, what do you think?
The story was not was given to Plato by his parents, right? It had been passed down as oral history. I was a big fan of Joseph Campbell a number of years ago, and some of this conversation, piqued that idea that ancient man in the rise of the priestly class, they had started by observing regularities in the sky. They'd seen that the orbits of the planets and the movement of the stars during the seasons was very orderly, and there was an idea that the gods were very orderly, and that in order to be able to have morality on Earth, we wanted to create a macrocosm microcosm correspondence, so that things were happening down here the same way that they were happening in the skies above. I am reticent to use the word heavens, but in order to be able to achieve morality, these, you wanted to have this macrocosmic correspondence. And it would seem to me that if someone would think of a civilization in the sky as being the idea that there would be that we would have a polis down here, we would want that to model the polis that there was in the heavens. and the polis that there was in the heavens would have been as miraculous and symmetrical and ordered as anything that we could conceive. Therefore, the idea of what that would be something described by Plato that he got from his parents with this, the great circles and the canals and hey, I'd love to be in a place with natural hot and cold running water. So, I think that this is mythology that has been brought down through Plato for the purpose of, perhaps with no purpose at all, but just to show that we can have this macroscopic, microscopic correspondence that seems to bring order to the ancient world.
Well, thank you, Moshe. And I think that's, maybe in a sense you're touching a little bit on the idea of forms in terms of this idea that there could be a model on Earth of something that is heavenly. And maybe that's a little bit of the idea of creating a particular out of a general form. And that's one of the themes that we discuss very much in Phaedrus. I think, again, this idea that things here can be modeled on things elsewhere. I think you also talked about symmetry, you use that word, and I would just, in the notes that I've posted on the shared drive, I took a quote from 106b from the Critias, and let me just read this briefly before we go to Anthony, and then we'll go to Joel, but let me just read this briefly. 106b, where Socrates says, "Now I offer my prayer to that God who came to be long ago in reality, but who has just now been created in my words. My prayer is that he grant the preservation of all that has been spoken properly, but that he will impose the proper penalty if we have, despite our best intentions, spoken in any discordant note here. For the musician who strikes the wrong note, the proper penalty is to bring him back into harmony. To assure, then, that in the future we will speak as we should concerning the origin of the gods, we pray that he will grant the best and most perfect remedy, understanding." And I just read that because you use the word symmetry, and there's that kind of theme of harmony in what I just read. And I think the idea of harmony also plays very much in the Phaedrus. So thanks for bringing that idea to us, this idea of some sort of harmony with some sort of greater general form of a civilization. We'll go to Anthony and then to Joel. Anthony, you're muted.
There's another thing that they can do for like a human brain when they have like brain damage, right? They put like a wire inside their head, and they had like the computer reader that like reads through the brain and make them think and start waking up and seeing vision and start hearing again. I don't know what that thing called that goes in the brain that make the brain damaged people to see again.
Well, good point.
In the future.
Yeah, it's and so the brain, I guess, has this ability, as you said, to be damaged, but then it can also be repaired. And so maybe the idea that that in sort of finding memory in dialogue, maybe as we're doing here, is maybe one way that we can do that. So yeah, let's see where we can go with that. We'll go to Joel.
Good morning, everybody. My quick question, it's going to be a quick one, referring to whether or not if Atlantis was actually real or not. And I would like to propose maybe that the overall message and authenticity that Atlantis, the story of Atlantis brings through Plato or other different types of mythologies lose its substance when people get into this very long, exhaustive historical account of whether or not it actually existed. Because I know I have friends who watch this channel called Gaia, so to speak. I don't watch it myself, but it's very much like this kind of anything goes, where everything from aliens to shape-shifting angels and demons and government and throughout history and places like Atlantis could even be possible. So it's just very much it's just anything goes within that arena. But even when we look back at something like Homer of Iliad or anything through Charles Dickens, for example, I think maybe the message that people like them or even Shakespeare if we get into this whole like, well, did it actually happen? And if it didn't, then it kind of loses its substance. So I think it would almost be counterintuitive to get into this whole back and forth of whether or not if it was real. And that's all.
Yeah, I mean, it's and I guess that's the other question that I asked at the beginning was if we could establish that it was real, then what difference would that make? What is it that drives people to spend their life looking for Atlantis, and what is it that brings us to venues like this to discuss Atlantis? Not just for a day, but this has been happening for thousands of years. So what is it, and what difference would it make if we could prove that Atlantis was true? I'm interested in hearing what people have to think about that. Greg?
Quick response to what you say. I mean, I think the fact that Plato said this made the story has a lot of credibility and imagination for people, because that's the earliest version of what can people say. And he said it beautifully. And I think there's always one drive. People always like to think that before human is able to come to this day, there was ancient time that humans were very smart and somehow connected to God. So human really want to be divine. And I think that's one connection to them. So that's quick comment. But what I was raising the hand was for another quick response to what you said about the harmony. Thank you for copying that paragraph there. When I first read it, I didn't really get the sense, but now it come to a connection. I don't know. It's the first time to me. Is Plato some kind of want to point out the connection between human understanding of the words or speeches to the harmony of sounds. Really, it's beautiful. I think the first time that I see this way that we always say we understand something. Well, that is the harmony that bring out between the words, expressions. This is one point I got from today, your writing and the discussion you had, to connect harmony, understanding in such a way. Beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. It's a theme that was definitely present in Phaedrus in terms of our communication and understanding of general forms as well as the particular forms in which we exist. Eva, did you have a point?
Yeah, I am not allowed to raise hands because I'm the host. So I wanted to raise my real hand. So I want to empathize with this person who just came out of the war and questioning democracy, seeing all the problems around himself. He discovers his ability to think, and he realizes that people are listening to him, Plato. So I think when you get that you are around problems and you have concerns about the country or the time you're living because of your problems, I think he used his chance to just win people's attention on the fact like there could be a way. Maybe there was a time that there was a good living for people. There was a city that people lived in harmony. So Atlantis comes in a package. It means there was good living. I don't want to call it democracy, but like a good living for all. So I think he used the power of fiction, because fiction could be future's history. So I think he used a card there. And personally, I want to believe that Atlantis exists. And I want to believe that we can even do better than Atlantis in a way. So that's why I wanted to share.
Mm-hmm.
Well, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's this idea of believing what we can do compared to other civilizations, I think is an interesting thought. And it makes me think about our perception of time. And again, I think that point actually that was made in the Ancient Greece Declassified podcast episode that the ancient Greeks did not think of time as linear as we do. Now, they thought of time as a kind of a circular function. And I think if we realize that we have things to learn from ancient civilizations, things that may have been forgotten, or comparisons that we can do to ancient civilizations, maybe that affects us significantly in the way that we approach things. Eric, what do you think? Welcome to Plato's Pod.
Yeah, thanks for the welcome. I appreciate what everybody's saying. I guess I just wanted to point or just bring up the other aspects of Plato's philosophy which might have led to him believing what he was saying, particularly knowledge as remembrance, and also the question of whether it's fact or fiction. I don't know if that's how Plato was thinking about it. I don't know if he was kind of going about kind of coming up with this vision, this utopic vision, kind of like what Greg was saying, in that way, that this is like this is an aspiration, more like perhaps he had heard stories passed down from his parents and others, other relations, and he took those stories and, through what he believed to be the theory of remembering, or knowledge as remembering, or recollection, and that coupled with, I don't know, something like that, he could conceive of this model as being something like a divine inspiration that is informed by his understanding of the eternal forms, being kind of like, if he could intuit the perfection and the harmony and the beauty of these forms, then they inform this vision that he had of like an ideal human society or civilization. And it must be real for the reasons that his philosophy tells him, that he's remembering, he's divinely inspired. He's not making these ideas, these notions of harmony or beauty up, but he's receiving them almost, or remembering them, those two things together. And versus that, in contrast to, thinking of it like this is an aspirational model or anything, that he might have actually believed in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you. It's, you talk about knowledge as recollection, and that's one of the great lines in the Meno, which we discussed, and this continual presentation that Plato does as the soul is that which remembers. And again, not just in Meno, where he says specifically knowledge is recollection, or Socrates says knowledge is recollection, but again in Phaedrus, where that story of Thoth that we looked at a few weeks ago, this idea that the soul is constantly able to remember. And so you spoke, Eric, about intuiting, and so maybe that's kind of like the imaginative function. And maybe that's a great power of the knowledge that we have, is that it can lead to imagination. And certainly the story of Atlantis has fired the imagination for thousands of years. JK, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. What Eric just said about the forms, and that the idea of going back, in time to a model, maybe a model of a perfect society. Plato is going back, relying on Atlantis maybe as a model for a perfect society, and trying to emulate that to deal with the problems in the present, and how to establish a more perfect society in the present and for the future. And then you see that in Confucius in China. Confucius, the famous Chinese philosopher, also was hearkening back to a civilization, a society in the past, as relying on that as a model to develop his philosophy and how we should live and so forth. So that's what Plato's doing is consistent with his idea of forms. That is it is a recollection of something that's in our that's in the past. And in modern day terms, Jung's psychology of the unconscious, is premise on these collective forms that we have, that perhaps and then we according to him, we rely on these forms, these archetypes and so forth, to understand our psychological problems, our relationships with society, and how to and so they're like models for appropriate behavior and so forth, and how we can deal with some of the problems that we have, psychologically and politically and socially. So so maybe Atlantis is this kind of idea of a past. So like in today, modern philosophers are going back to the pre-Socratics as a model of a model of what is virtue, and what is how to establish a more perfect society. Heidegger going back to Heraclitus and these French philosophers, Derrida, critiquing all the errors that were committed, since Plato, and going back to the pre-Socratics and so forth. So maybe that there's something like that going on here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And the interesting reference to a number of other philosophers, including Confucius. I think this idea, again, of a model, and tying that into the idea of the forms. And the forms themselves were kind of held to be ideas or ideals. And this is how we maybe model things, is based on these kind of ideals or templates. And, may go, kind of to, again, to this idea that Eric was talking about as knowledge being recollection. What we're recalling are these ideas maybe, and building on them. It's worth reminding people, that both Timaeus and Critias. So Timaeus and Critias were successive dialogues. One picks up, Critias picks up after Timaeus, but both pick up after the day before these dialogues happened. Socrates and the group had finished discussing the content of what's in the Republic. That great political work of Plato's, which kind of provides a model for society, or does it provide an accurate model for society? And actually, I'm just reminded again at the beginning of Timaeus, where Socrates actually criticizes what happened in their discussion about the Republic. And this is a theme that I want to pick up when we get into the Republic. I want to pick up on this theme, but at Timaeus 19b, Socrates is criticizing the model that they base their Republic on, by saying that it's as if he was looking at a painting, he says. And one finds himself longing to look at these objects in motion, or engaged in some struggle or conflict that seems to show off their distinctive physical qualities. I feel the same thing about the city we've described. He's talking about the Republic here. I'd love to listen to someone give a speech depicting our city in a contest with other cities competing for those prizes that cities typically compete for. I'd love to see our city distinguish itself in the way it goes to war and the way it pursues the war. So in other words, he's saying, he actually uses the term two-dimensional. They created a two-dimensional structure in the Republic. That was not a sufficient model, maybe, is what he's saying at Timaeus 19b for the society that they talked about in the Republic, because you need to expand that two-dimensional model into 3 dimensions to see how it moves about, because the people are the movers. So I think it's an important point, what you just said about modeling, JK. And basing societies on this. And we can think about that in terms of Atlantis. Moshe, your thoughts?
Yeah, the idea of a perfect society interests me. I think, my reading of the Republic is that it is describing a system of governance where it can be read as political philosophy, where how we would have a well-ordered society, how society would work and would flourish, and we could have good citizens in a good state. And it seems to me that if you can describe having good citizens in a good state, wouldn't it be great if we could have some good real estate and landscape architecture for our perfect society to live in? And so that would be Atlantis.
Indeed. Yeah, it's and certainly in this artist rendition on my screen background, Atlantis was, by all accounts, a beautiful landscaping, physical rendering of this model. This model was kind of maybe like a form, an ideal, and they took this ideal and rendered it in physics. Jane, what do you think?
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to, I guess, add a small remark to what Moshe was saying, because when I was looking at the photo, not the photo, at the pictures, images of Atlantis that we can find online, what I was thinking about is that Plato's Republic has I guess it could be called a caste system that is divided into three. And it's kind of interesting that Atlantis has it has the center and two rings around it. If talking about like the meaning of Atlantis and whether it exists or not, I think that it carries great symbolic meaning as a model, as a sort of perfect shadow of a Platonic idea or form. And it would even seem to me at some point that whether or not it actually physically existed would be not as important to Plato as the fact that it is a more or less ideal reflection of what a form or idea of a society would look like. And so in a sense, to Plato, it would be more real than an actual Atlantis actually existing in reality. And the other thing that I like about Atlantis is it is a way of humbling the modern person, like entertaining this idea that it could have existed. And just because it seems unimaginable or unreal, it doesn't mean that it couldn't have existed. Maybe there are things that we have not discovered about the world, about ourselves, about our history. And so at least it made me think that it's a good exercise to humble ourselves and to realize that even if we do know a lot compared to what sort of the entire world encompasses, is just a very, very small fragment of it. And perhaps Atlantis is this is probably a very fantastic idea, but I've also thought of it as Atlantis being sort of this alternative road that humanity could have taken again and come up to Atlantis again. So sort of we're living an alternative road of progress, of human progress in comparison to Atlantis. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, actually. And that actually leads into, Jane, I think, a reading that we could do. And Eva, if you wouldn't mind sharing the screen, and it's the second page, Eva, that I wanted to do that reading number one. But just before we do that, while Eva's setting up the screen, I wanted to talk about what Jane just said, because I think this idea, Jane used the word humbling. And I'm wondering if Plato wanted to kind of put that sense of humility in us, or let us think about that sense of humility. And I wanted to be a little bit more specific about this idea of what would it mean to us if we discovered that Atlantis was true, that it was a true story. For example, that the screen image behind me, an artist rendering of Atlantis, that it was true. What would that do? And thinking about, what was said earlier about time, maybe we approach time as being a linear thing, and we think that we are the pinnacle or the peak of knowledge in time. What if time isn't that way? What if time is actually circular? What would that do to our thinking about ourselves? And I think Jane hit the nail on the head with the word humbling. Maybe that we would realize that we have more things that we need to learn, perhaps. So that's a thought that I wanted to pick up on and echo from what Jane used in the word humbling, and the idea that Atlantis might be an alternative vision of what we could achieve. So on the second page, Eva, there's a reading that starts at 120E and goes to 121B. And I'm wondering if I could have any volunteers to read just these two paragraphs for us. If anybody would be interested in volunteering for this, or I can read it if, well, let me read it then. And so this is 120E to 121B. And in this, Plato says, for many generations, and as long as enough of their divine nature survived, they were obedient unto their laws, and they were well disposed to the divinity they were kin to. So he's talking about the Atlanteans. They possessed conceptions that were true and entirely lofty. And in their attitude to the disasters and chance events that constantly befall men, and in their relations with one another, they exhibited a combination of mildness and prudence, because, except for virtue, they held all else in disdain and thought their present good fortune of no consequence. They bore their vast wealth of gold and other possessions without difficulty, treating them as if they were a burden. They did not become intoxicated with the luxury of the life their wealth made possible. They did not lose their self-control and slip into decline, but in their sober judgment, they could see distinctly that even their very wealth increased with their amity and its companion virtue. But they saw that both wealth and concord decline as possessions become pursued and honored, and virtue perishes with them as well. So in this first paragraph, he's described, I think, what's kind of a nirvana, or utopia was a word that somebody had used earlier. But there's a warning in this last sentence. But they saw that both wealth and concord being another word for harmony, decline as possessions become pursued and honored. So here, really talking about the way materialism sort of interferes with our harmony with the metaphysical, with that which is not material, and virtue perishes with them as well. So in the second paragraph, now because these were their thoughts, and because of the divine nature that survived in them, they prospered greatly, as we have already related. But when the divine portion in them began to grow faint, as it was often blended with great quantities of mortality, and as their human nature gradually gained ascendancy, at that moment, in their inability to bear their great good fortune, they became disordered. To whoever had eyes to see, they appeared hideous, since they were losing the finest of what were once their most treasured possessions. But to those who were blind to the true way of life, oriented to happiness, it was at this time that they gave the semblance of being supremely beauteous and blessed. Yet inwardly, they were filled with an unjust lust for possessions and power. And speaking of power, I mean, these two paragraphs really struck me quite powerfully. I don't know whether it's just me, but I see parallels between what's being described here for Atlantis and maybe how modern society has developed in terms of perhaps a materialist approach. Does virtue perish with materialism? And then also this question of appearance in the second paragraph. Those who see their true nature becoming distorted by materialism see them as ugly, but others who can't look through that true nature see them as beautiful. And maybe that's one of the things that we are at risk of if we follow that path that the Atlanteans took and become materialist. Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that these two paragraphs are powerful, and I think that second to last sentence in the second paragraph is one of the most important and tremendous even declarations in this dialogue. And so I just as much as this dialogue, like, it's almost more of a depiction than a philosophy, but the big philosophical question that it poses, I think one of them at least, is like, what is it? What is this mortal or human kind of entrance into this conception that corrupts? Like, this isn't developed in this dialogue; it's developed elsewhere. But it's kind of one of the big questions that the Critias or whatever left me with, and I think that that second to last sentence in the second paragraph there is tremendous as far as like the philosophical virtue, I guess, that it has reached.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that second to last sentence that you're referring to, again, just to read it, though, to whoever had eyes to see, they appeared hideous, since they were losing the finest of what were once their most treasured possessions.
And then the other one, but to those who were blind to the true way of life, oriented to happiness, it was at this time that they gave the semblance of being supremely beauteous and blessed, that that you could be so mistaken, I guess.
Yeah, and elsewhere, and we've got another reading where in the Critias, where Plato talks about art again, picking up on a theme again that he explored in Phaedrus, and the effect of art on us, and he picks up on this in the Critias. So we've got a reading on that. But the question is, how do we depict these things? So here we're seeing the potential of a depiction of the Atlanteans as good and beautiful, and another potential of depicting the Atlanteans as ugly for what they had become. And we have to be careful at understanding the way we approach and understand these depictions, these forms that we've generated based on these ideals. Thank you. Moshe?
Well, this is certainly a rich paragraph, isn't it? Going back to my idea of the microcosmic, macrocosmic correspondence, it seems to me here that we're talking about two different things, maybe four different things. We've got a divine nature and we've got a human nature. And the divine nature is pure and utopian and perfect. And the human nature is free and chaotic and subject to decay, a world of becoming. And as the two worlds were together in the early days of Atlantis, everything was working fine. But then in the later days, as the human nature, the nature of decay and freedom started to take ascendancy, virtue was lost, and the connection between the divine and the human was separated. And the probably as a result of that, Atlantis ceased to exist as a physical or a real thing.
Thank you. I think you used words that remind me of again of Timaeus 28a, my favorite among my favorite passages in Timaeus, that distinction between the realm that always is and never becomes, and the realm that is always becoming but never is. And that fundamental distinction in the construction of the universe that Plato presents in Timaeus, I think is one that just resonated in what you just said. And so I put the question out there, does everyone think that we are necessarily distinct from God or from a greater source, or are we part of a greater source? And maybe that's fundamentally the way we think about ourselves, and we think about the progression of time as well. There's these words in here in the second paragraph. It's in the second sentence in the second paragraph. But when the divine portion in them began to grow faint, as it was often blended with great quantities of mortality, and as their human nature gradually gained ascendancy, at that moment in their inability to bear the great good fortune, they became disordered. And so it's this idea that we've got sort of innate order built into us, but then we can fall into disorder when we lose that connection with the order that's innately built into us. I thought that was a very powerful expression, actually, there. And this idea maybe that this constant idea that Plato's presenting in Phaedo, in Meno, that the soul is a derivative of God, and so as a derivative, it would necessarily be part of God. We'll take Greg and then JK and then Moshe again. Greg?
Okay, I'm mute. Yeah.
There you go.
I respond to Moshe that said that the divine connection versus the human nature. It seems that Plato, in his mind, is very firm about the bad human nature. Human nature are not divine, and he's point out that as the human nature gains strength, they lose their divine portion. But he didn't seem to point out how can we gain the divine nature. I mean, are we born with divine nature, or it has to be gained? Throughout his dialogue so far, I have not seen that. But here, he clearly, confirms his belief that human nature is bad. I mean, if we let it control, we lose our divine quality. And I feel this is a question to me. But I'd like to ask a question to Eric, to elaborate. You point out the second sentence to be most important to you, and I see this indeed conveys a lot of meaning. But to me, I couldn't understand well. It seems to be as a paradoxical. On the one hand, someone is blind to the truth, means blind to the truth. But on the other hand, that someone will have the supreme beauties and blessed. It seems to be contradictory to me. Could Eric elaborate on that?
Well, thank you, Eric. Did you want to jump in before we go to JK?
Sure. Yes. I mean, that's, I think, what the kind of, the paradox, I guess, the difference between appearance and truth. And really, I mean, this is something that in our time would perhaps be more troubling to answer than in Plato's time. But of course, Plato, received opposition, I'm sure, too. But that he was convinced. I mean, this is a big philosophical idea that the appearance is incorrect, that what you see is not. I mean, Plato's formulation is that what you see is a corruption of what was, of being, of the eternal forms. And I mean, okay. So I very much appreciated, I think it was Jane or something, said that, that the conception of Atlantis kind of leads to a humility or humbling. One of the questions posed by this conception, this fantastic conception, is I can conceive this. Why isn't it the case? Like, why isn't this the way that things are? And the humility and the humbling of kind of comparing and contrasting where we are to what could be very well the ideal. Like how far are we away from the best of our conceptions? And then looking around and asking that question again and again, perhaps. And there the distinction grows between the ideal and the appearance. Yeah. So it becomes an ethical question as much as a metaphysical question. I don't know. Not to bring those terms up, but that's the best I can do. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And actually, what I think we'll have a chance to pursue that idea when we read 107B to 107D. And I like the words that you used. What you see is a corruption of what was. And I think that's maybe the problem of creating a model and then, designing your physics on that model without fully understanding the model. So that was I found that a powerful turn of words. We'll go to Moshe and then JK and then Jane. Moshe?
On the last slide, if you could go back to that. Well, you don't have to go back to that. But this is a story of this 9,000 years ago, okay? 9,000 years before Plato. I think one of the things that I see out of the last paragraph is a distinction, I will call it a growth that we see in Plato from the two-part nature of the soul, divine and human, to the three-part nature of the soul, which is described in the Phaedrus with the allegory of the chariot. Because what's missing in this is reason. We've got the good nature, we've got the divine nature, but we don't have anything to bring them together. Reason is missing. And I take that as a very interesting, perhaps not profound observation that when we see later in Plato the importance of reason in civil governance, something is added that brings a stability to human life that this particular myth is lacking.
That was the perfect setup, Moshe, for reading 107b to 107d. I think that idea that you just said about reason and having a reason to count, and again to tie that back to Timaeus 28a, where Plato says that to understand the realm that always is and never becomes, you have to do that understanding with a reason to count. You can't apply your senses to it because it has no physical existence. You can only understand with your senses that which has physical existence, but not that which always is and never becomes. And so I think I very much like what you just said in terms of tying that into what Plato goes on to say at 107b to 107b. We'll go to JK and then Jane and Joel. JK?
The question is, how did they arrive at that divine nature in the first place without reason? And so that means that they must have relied on some understanding and some reasonable understanding to have arrived at that divine nature. Now you have to ask, what is that divine nature and how did it get corrupted? And if you posit a divine nature as something that is and never becomes, right? Then was it maybe because they mistook that isness of divine nature as something that would never change, right? And in the beginning, they seem to accept, this kind of, this change and the immortality of their state of in their possession of luxuries and so forth. They were not intoxicated by their luxuries in life and wealth. So, and they accepted the change, the loss of that as they grew old and died. But I think the mistake was to assume that those luxuries and the wealth would stay with them, right? They eventually became intoxicated and became addicted to those possessions, as if they would never, they wouldn't let go. They didn't want to let go of them. They didn't want to accept the change. So I think it's a kind of like not being able to accept the change is what corrupted this divine nature. the divine nature is this idea of being able to accept the change, their mortality, and to let go of what they had. And so it's this, I think it's a misconception of what being and becoming is. I think they became attached to the idea of being and wanted the things to remain the same. Instead of because without that, the idea of becoming, without the idea of change, there's no creativity, there's no novelty anymore. And so I think that's how they lost their virtue and became divine, virtue and became corrupted, or the other way around. Yeah. But anyway, so I think it comes back to the idea of what is divine and this paradox of being and becoming. Can you have being without becoming?
I really like the way you put that, JK. Really like the way that distinction between being and becoming. And the idea that we're endowed with this ability to vary our existence. We're endowed with this ability to be creative and not always static. And I think that goes maybe to what Eric was saying earlier about, being able to intuit, being able to imagine. Is that what you were thinking about in terms of being and becoming, that distinction?
Right, because they couldn't accept the notion of difference.
Mm-hmm.
It's the difference that makes life precious, and not be attached to what is actual, and always be able to have that potential to grow and to be reborn, and I think that's what the idea of divine perhaps means. A divine nature is to have that kind of creative spirit.
The word potential that you just used, I think, is an important one in terms of perhaps understanding the capacity of the divine, and maybe this idea that potential is in all of us, but we can't sort of become wedded to the material because that reduces our potential. I think you put that very powerfully, and you said a number of very interesting things that they became attached to the idea of being without realizing that which they could become. And maybe there's a lesson for us in that today, that we become fixed, we become fixated on these conceptions that may or may not be accurate renderings of what is actually divine. I would just, before we go on to Jane and then Joel, I just would want to just very briefly read at 120A and B in Critias, the idea that the laws were set in stone, and unfortunately this is not in one of the slides, but this is just in the, I didn't have a chance to put this one on the slides, but at 120A and B, it's a very short thing. They talked about this idea of the divine laws being set in stone for the citizens of Atlantis. And they would draw the blood from a mixing bowl into gold pouring vessels, pouring the blood over the fire. They would take an oath to render justice according to the laws inscribed in the stele, and to punish anyone who had violated these laws since they last met. So this was an annual ritual that they went through, and the laws were written down on stone. Like, it doesn't say who wrote them down on stone. The stone was ascribed to the god Poseidon, but was that whoever did the inscription, did they understand what Poseidon had described? And was Poseidon the top god? Well, no, at the end we learned that Zeus was the top god. So did Poseidon provide an accurate account to whoever did the inscription? And so they built the society around whatever was inscribed on the stone, and they punished people who didn't adhere to it. And so that's kind of where ideas become fixed. and maybe they departed from the realm of becoming, and they got stuck in the realm of being, according to some maybe false notion. So I just wanted to read that brief section before we go on to Jane. Jane, what are your thoughts?
There's so much I wanted to say. Because there's way too many ideas going on right now. And James, you just took it to the next step with that. I didn't pay attention to that detail in the dialogue, but this kind of takes it to the next level. I was going to say that I can't really, and this is not exactly like my sort of ideas. This is the way that I interpret each and every dialogue based on what I read before on Plato or about Plato. And the way that I see it is that being and becoming, the Atlantis came into non-being, so disappeared, not because it was being, but because it entered into the stages of becoming. Whatever is becoming, it degrades and decays and disappears with time. So the way that I saw it is that Atlantis, initially, the rulers, they were a part of being. And as they gained more and more of humanness in them, of mortality, they began, like anything that is from the becoming, to decay and disappear. So to me, it was the other way around, that in order to preserve Atlantis, they should have preserved the being, the eternal part of them. And I think, and this, I guess, sort of touches upon what, James, you just mentioned, that there's this important factor of understanding whether the idea that you have in your hands, is it idea that is being, or is it an idea that is becoming? Because if we take an idea that we think is part of the eternal, is part of the being, and we give it that status of non-movement and internalness, and we try to encapsulate everything within this idea, then that idea is going to degenerate and decay and destroy whatever was put inside of it, because it is part of becoming. So something that is changing, but will inevitably disappear or get destroyed, and so on. Regarding the soul, the way that I understood the structure of the soul of the human based on the Timaeus, as there is a third element that does tie the reason or the intellect to the body, and that is the soul. In terms of universal structure, Plato, I believe, called it the essence. So you have the eternal and you have the becoming, and it's tied together with the essence. And when we're looking at the individual or the human, that is the soul that helps the intellect or reason to be tied down to the body, the corporeal. And okay, I'll try to be short. The last thing that I wanted to, I really liked the extract that we looked at a little earlier. I thought it was one of the best parts of the dialogue. And whenever I read Plato's dialogues, why I like them so much is each and every one of them has these pieces, these small extracts that make me feel more sane. And this is definitely one of those extracts. I don't know, it really made a lot of the puzzle pieces fit in my mind about the world and about a lot of the things that I was experiencing. And I especially like to the end of it about what is beauty. And I believe Eric mentioned this, the words aesthetics and ethics. That was actually what I was thinking about too. I mean, in modern society, if we look at like philosophical discussions, we don't know what is what, who gets to decide what is ethically correct or what is aesthetically correct. And this dialogue, I was so stunned by it. So there are people who could look at something which is actually sort of decay and destruction and see beauty and think that it is a blessing and so on. But those people can be blind. Who gets to decide? How do we know that? How do we know who's actually seeing or who's actually being blind? Because the person who sees, he sees something hideous. But the person who sees in that hideous something beautiful, they're going to say, well, something's wrong with you. You should be more optimistic, for example. I don't know. I'm going to leave it at that because I could say a lot more. But this piece of the dialogue, it was just, absolutely beautiful. And I think a separate book could be written about that piece of dialogue. Yes, thank you.
Indeed, thank you, Jane. I couldn't agree with you more. It's there's so many things that we could explore with just even one sentence that Plato writes. And that's what fascinates me about Plato and what drives me to host these sessions with Eva. I mean, it's just I learn something every single time, and each time I read it, I learn something new, and each time it's discussed, I learn something new. And so, I mean, one of the things, I mean, you touched on so many important points, Jane, and a number of them tied on I think it was what J.K. said in terms of difference makes life precious. And again, thinking back to Timaeus, and the idea that in this creation of the universe, he talked about the mixing of the same and the different, and that it's a difficult mixture. And then in Phaedrus, he presents the idea of the soul being the charioteer. The soul's got two horses pulling in opposite directions, and it's like the charioteer is tying those two horses together. And how does it tie the horses together? Well, it ties the horses together with a reason to count. It ties the horses together by trying to determine what's believable, and that's what we do, I think, in dialogue. So we'll go to Joel, and while we're doing that, Eva, if you wouldn't mind preparing the reading on the third page, it's labeled number 2. We'll go and read that because it talks very much about this idea of what we actually believe. But we'll go to Joel.
Hey guys, so I have to leave shortly, but before I do, this has been absolutely incredible. And Jane, you gave me a lot of food for thought. Before I go though, just for fun, I'd like to play the antagonist here, and I would like to tackle what exactly does the word divine mean per se? Because the impression I get is whenever you use anything and describe it as divine, I think of something that is like supernatural or perfect or somehow transcends logic and reason. And I find, even though I recognize the utility of equating the soul or intellect to something that can relate to whatever is divine, I feel like there's also, even though it's useful, it can also be dangerous too, because it's easy to describe but not give a complete definition of perfection in terms of like, okay, what is perfection? What is divine? And all you can really do is just describe it for what it's not, so to speak, right? It's like, well, it's without error, it's without limitations, but like, what is it specifically? And you can only describe it in negative terms, so to speak. So I feel like there's also a risk or towing the line, a danger when we're trying to describe what is somehow eternal or transcendent in like sort of an anthropomorphic perspective of like, oh, this is something that is somehow related to my mind or our minds, or something that we could strive to or in some way obtain, if you will. Maybe you can't, but like I think also it could be dangerous when we're trying to describe it and give it like sort of our desires, our purpose, our needs, our wants and emotions, so to speak, because at some point, as we all know throughout history, somebody's going to come across and be like, aha, like I figured it out, I got it, this is divine. And it could be completely used in the opposite direction, and it turns into chaos and insanity and just flat out ignorance. So I think yeah, that I could see the utility. It's useful, but I don't really know what the word divine means at the end of the day. It's very this kind of spooky, abstract word that it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around.
That was powerful, Joel. When you said we can only describe the divine by what it is not, that appeared to me as a particularly powerful piece of logic that we could explore here. What do people think about that? And maybe it relates to why Plato ended this dialogue the way that he did. And I want to discuss that before we finish. So we've got another half hour roughly. And I want to get to that because, it's said that this dialogue is, quote, unfinished because it ends by saying, and Zeus said ... and then that's it, right? And so is that, does that relate to what you just said, Joel? Is that where we have to stop trying to define the divine, because we can only define the divine by what it's not?
James,
Incredibly powerful
can I
thought.
just,
Yeah,
can I-
Eva, and then we'll go to Moshe and JK. Eva?
this was great timing, Joel, because when you say divine and we are talking, we hear Plato talking about a system, group of people trying to find the right way of living. Speaking of divine, I think he has other parts, other times that he is talking about the self and the self-responsibility. So yeah, it's okay to see the group of people, countries or cultures, like people were born in their own groups, clans, or whatever they were, but we are all individuals. And it will be missing if we don't speak about the self and what is happening with the self. Can the community, country, or the group be and stay, exist as virtuous if people are not virtuous? And the fact that we are talking about the concept of time, history, current, and the past, so things will be shifting, just like the communities or lifestyles of or group of people. A person is growing and a person is changing too. I think what he is, or I enjoy hearing Plato is he is talking about both the community, my group, and my own personal responsibilities as a human being, because I want to believe like we are all responsible individuals as Plato or anyone else here on the screen on with ourselves on our homes with our computers. So just wanted to remark the personal understanding of the virtue and the divine. Joel, thank you.
Thank you both. It's and again, just to remind everyone of what we just read in that section, where Plato talks about the divine portion in us, and so he's saying that there's a bit of the divine in each of us, and then I think what we just heard from Eva and Joel is that the divine is also in all of us. So it's in each, but it's in all. Kind of like this idea of the one and the many. Which is obviously one of the big subjects of Parmenides, which we will get to. So it's that powerful idea, and that's why I asked earlier. What do people think about this idea? Are we separate and apart from God, or are we part of God? So I think that's maybe fundamentally inherent in this whole discussion. Before we go to the reading, we'll go to Moshe and then JK.
Okay, I want to make the distinction between how we as 21st century people use terms like divine and God, and the way Plato used them. And we have ample evidence for how Plato used them in the dialogues that he wrote. Okay, and James, you've brought up a number of times about memory and how we know things. And in the Phaedrus around 248, is talking about how the souls, which are ultimately going to go into the human body, they're longing for the upper world, and they all follow, but not being strong enough. They are carried around the surface, plunging and treading on one another, each striving to be first, and they're clawing with perspiration to get closer and closer to the forms. And it's important to understand that that's the kind of knowledge that we want, is this knowledge of the forms, the permanent, the beautiful, the unchangeable. And it says in 249, I don't have the A, B, C, or D, but it says, clinging in recollection to those things in which God abides, clinging to the forms in which God abides, he's living there, and in beholding which he is what he is. So God is only God because he's closest to the forms. So there's no divinity here, like there's no sort of anthropomorphic divinity. There's certainly no theistic divinity. Divinity is a kind of knowledge that we have when we can become close to reality, when we can become close to the forms. And then that's important to know so that we know what Plato is saying. The other thing is, as 21st century people, we might look back on that and say, well, that's just a bunch of hooey. There are no forms. We can be critical of it. We can say whatever we want. But I think it's important that we do two things. We have to understand what Plato says, and then we want to address the question of whether what Plato says is true or false, or if there's some nuance to it.
Thank you. And in the course of what we do, I think a reasoned account is required, and that's our capacity to create a reasoned account in discussions like this. And so you raised a very important point, I think, about the nature of divine, and maybe it goes to this distinction of whether you believe that there is a personal God, in other words, a God that will intercede on your individual behalf, or whether God is more like, I've heard the term used, Spinoza's God, the kind of God that Spinoza or Einstein believed in, the God that created the initial conditions for everything else to flourish. That isn't an individual God, but it's a God for all. And so I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind, I think, as we explore these concepts and this idea of the soul as being that single point that judges always that ratio between same and different, to try to find that one single line that connects to that singularity of God. So those were really fascinating points, and that really does lead into that reading. So Eva, if you wouldn't mind putting that on the screen. And again, I would ask, would we have a volunteer? This is just 2 relatively short paragraphs. If anybody would volunteer to read this, or I can read it again if...
I guess you're reading it, James. Thank you.
I'm reading it. All right, I don't mind. This is from 107B to 107D, and so this relates to, again, that idea of, what is divine and how do we describe that which is divine. So it's 2 paragraphs, the first of which: it is easier, Timaeus, for someone to give the impression that he is a successful speaker when he speaks of gods to an audience of mortals. The audience's lack of experience and sheer ignorance concerning a subject they can never know for certain provide the would-be speaker with great eloquence. We know how we stand when it comes to our knowledge of the gods. To make my meaning plainer, let me ask you to follow me in this illustration. It is inevitable, I suppose, that everything we have all said is a kind of representation and attempted likeness. Let us consider the graphic art of the painter that has as its object the bodies of both gods and men, and the relative ease and difficulty involved in the painter's convincing his viewers that he has adequately represented the objects of his art. We will observe first that we are satisfied if an artist is able to represent, even to some small extent, the earth and mountains and rivers and forests and all of heaven and all the bodies that exist and move within it, and render their likeness. And next, that since we have no precise knowledge of such things, we do not examine these paintings too closely or find fault with them, but we are content to accept an art of suggestion and illusion for such things, as vague and deceptive as this art is. But when a painter attempts to create a likeness of our bodies, we are quick to spot any defect. And because of our familiarity and lifelong knowledge, we prove harsh critics of the painter who does not fully reproduce every detail. We must view the case of speeches as precisely the same. We embrace what is said about the heavens and things divine with enthusiasm, even when what is said is quite implausible, but we are nice critics of what is said of mortals and human beings. So again, I found this to be a particularly powerful section that relates very much to what we discussed in Phaedrus, and to the idea of, if there is a form of divine, how do we depict that form? Who has knowledge? Who has sufficient knowledge to depict that form of divine and to communicate that form of divine to the rest of us? Is there a warning in what we have here for us in today's times? This was written 2,400 years ago, but where is it? Is it relevant today? What are people's thoughts about this particular section and this idea of representation and illusion and how we avoid this trap, maybe? And is it a trap that maybe the people of Atlantis got caught in? JK, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we're still susceptible to concepts that others come up with and input into our minds, and that's sometimes it's called propaganda or politics or just conspiracy theories, right, about what is true and not true. And it's pretty pervasive, that on the mass media. Now that we have, personal media that we have access to on a daily basis, on a minute by minute basis, where these things, these concepts are, pervade, and so we're all constantly susceptible to these concepts of what is divine or what is, what is virtue, what is right and wrong, and so forth.
Very much, I think, and I'm wondering, does this relate at all to the way that Plato ended this dialogue, or didn't end the dialogue, as one might believe? Some believe he didn't end it. Some believe he didn't end it deliberately. Some believe he didn't end it by accident. He meant to get back to it. Why did he end it with that Zeus said ... And I think maybe one might remember here that Plato was a dramatist. He was a playwright before he became a geometer and philosopher. And as that, he was an artist. And did he want to represent what the divine was saying? I just wanted to bring that really struck me about the ending of this dialogue. That really struck me about the ending of this dialogue. That it's an attempt not to represent. Maybe it goes back to what Joel said, is we can only describe the divine by what it is not. And is that the reason why Plato ended this dialogue the way he did? I wanted to put that out there because I wanted to get to that ending before we end today. So we'll go to Moshe and then Eric. Moshe?
Two things. The Western mind falls into a trap, I think, when it comes to the divine. We can speak reams. There's literature abounding of what hell is like. Okay, we know what eternity is like. Dante's 13 hells and things like that, and so we could do the same thing with God. We have to arrogate ourselves to the point that we say that we can do it, but we arrogate ourselves to the same extent when we can describe what eternal damnation is like. So Western people have no qualms against claiming the intellectual high ground in areas where they have absolutely no knowledge at all and are simply making it up as artfully as they can as they go. So that's one thing. I think that we can describe God in positive terms. We're not limited to just negative terms to describe him. The other thing is about the paragraph that you read. And it reminds me of what Jane said earlier about having humility. We should not, we have to have humility when we describe what the gods are going to be like or what divinity is going to be like, because the very last paragraph, the very last sentence in there says that, if you put that slide up again, it says that when we listen to somebody talking about, yes, we embrace what is said about the heavens and things divine with enthusiasm, even when what is said is quite implausible. But we are nice critics of what is said of mortals and human beings. And by nice, if that's a good translation, he's being quite ironic, because he was talking previously in that paragraph about how we can be very critical about a person's painting of a body because we know what a body looks like. So being a nice critic doesn't mean I'm being a sweet critic. It means I'm really nice as a critic and I can really let you have it. So what we have to do, I think, when we are, we have to be humble in all things when it comes to the interpretation of what the divine is, something that we can not have scientific knowledge about. That being said, I still stand by my first point that to the extent that we can be super descriptive about what eternal damnation is, we can be super descriptive as well about what life in heaven would be like.
Thank you, Moshe, and for highlighting that last sentence in what we read. I think that's maybe that's a little bit of a warning based on what the citizens of Atlantis faced by following those inscriptions written in the stele in the stone that's where that was part of their problem. We'll go to Eric. Eric?
Just a few things. One, it's a shame that Joel left during that last reading, because I think that section definitely shares the same skepticism that he kind of brought up. And I think it's very poignant for the fact that it was mentioned in this dialogue, kind of at the top of the dialogue. Two, the second thing is well, I forget the second thing, but to Moshe's points, I mean, as far as the Western mind and kind of like the proclamations or declarations of the Western intellectual and the Western politician, whatever it might be, someone who's kind of who's like very motivated in the human realm, the political realm, kind of taking their cue from Aristotle. That the human is a political animal, for example. This mind and this, I'm not going to use the word arrogance, but there you go, is kind of like, it's the same mind that Socrates kind of sat across from again and again in these dialogues. And I guess I just wanted to mention or remind that, Socrates was as skeptical and ironic in any kind of grand declaration. He always kind of kept his distance from what could be said about anything, and about anything absolute, let's say. As far as, kind of to Joel's point too, that we only talk about the divine as regarding things that it is not, or that, wondering if that's all we can do. Again, just to remind, Socrates had a personal daemon, and I guess as it was described, or, it was described that he had one, and according to the description, it only told him what it was not. It also kind of spoke in these negative terms, like what not to do, what he should kind of move away from, but it didn't really have any according to, as far as I know, didn't have any really positive assertions. So when Socrates was sitting across from these kind of these minds that were convinced that they were right, regarding their profession, regarding their place in society and cosmos, whatever. He was always able to recognize by listening to this personal daemon and just for hours, just standing there kind of in deep kind of meditative thought. And also in the moment too, I suppose, becoming a bit skeptical and ironic with the declarations of others across from him, that whatever they're saying, it's not, it's not, they don't have it right as far as their conceptions of, what it is they're doing as a doctor, perhaps, what is, how do they apply their knowledge to things like health, and politicians too, like whatever that they think is the good, it's not that. And Socrates seemed to be at least convinced always that what he was hearing was not it. So I just wanted to bring up that Socrates never made these absolute declarations, I guess, or, he was always he kept his distance from them. And Plato, on the other hand, as a contrast, seemed to have more of a project in mind, that he was presenting these things. And it might have been the fact that he was writing, right? That he was kind of setting into stone, so to speak, these thoughts, and was able to kind of, all right, so that's it. And then the second thing that I was going to say is, yes, as far as the dialogue ending with "and Zeus says ... I mean, as far as it being like it's very compelling as a dramatic flourish that he left the question open-ended, whether or not the text was corrupted or he actually finished it. As a dramatist, if that was kind of how he was thinking about it, it's very effective that he kind of leaves open-ended what Zeus might have said. Thank you.
Thank you. It's yeah, I mean, I think certainly Socrates' method of asking questions and not presenting absolute conclusions is really part of Plato's method, maybe as well. And maybe that's kind of evident in the way that this dialogue ended. Instead of pretending to know what the words of Zeus were, Plato is leaving it to us in the realm of becoming to define what that is. So I thought that was and the way you put it, that there were no absolutes, I think maybe ties to what Joel said earlier about maybe being able to describe the divine only by what the divine is not, and that list can be endless. And so I think that's something well worth thinking about. And the other thing worth thinking about, I think, is this idea of the perhaps circular nature of time, which again is presented at the beginning of Timaeus, in that we go through these cycles where civilizations are built and then various cataclysms cause their destruction, and then we are reborn as children. We lose memory of all of that because of the cataclysm that has destroyed. And then we have to go and rediscover, and we don't want to maybe get caught in these almost like feedback loops of thinking that we know when we in fact don't know. And it was Socrates who said that he was the smartest man alive because he knew one thing, which is that he knew nothing. And that was kind of what the oracle said about him. And so maybe that's this idea that we really have to question what we think we know. So we'll go to JK and then Greg and Jane. JK?
Yeah. So you said Socrates was an ironist, but Plato was even more so himself, being an artist, right? Praising the artist. At the same time, he banished the artist, from his model of society in the Republic. But he kind of talked about Atlantis as a society that have fallen because of these ideas of notions of divinity inscribed in stone, right? And it kind of reminds me of the Ten Commandments, maybe also something similar to that, and maybe he kind of understood what it means when societies are established on these ideas of what is divine and so forth. Yeah. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
I think it's this idea, perhaps I heard this term was said by Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, who wrote Plato at the Googleplex, and I'm a big fan of Rebecca's. And she used this term in a lecture that I was listening to about epistemic responsibility. And, maybe if you think of time as a circle instead of a straight line, your responsibility in the circle never begins and never ends. It's continuously ongoing, because that's one of the properties of a circle, right? The circle has no beginning and no end. And so maybe this is part of the lesson here, is that maybe don't think about time as a straight line, because if you think of time as a straight line, then you're only going to ever see a progression, and your epistemic responsibility in that context is more limited. But if you think of time as a circle, these cycles of creation and destruction continuously going on, then the epistemic responsibility is quite endless. So I just wanted to raise that point, and maybe we can get to that last slide before we end, but we'll go to Greg and then to Jane.
Yeah, I just like to make a point. I think Rosh and J.K. earlier too mentioned a bit about this thing about the Western thinking about this divineness and the form, and as if implying that the Eastern have a different way of thinking that. And being someone grown up in the East and read quite a bit about the Chinese philosophy and so on, I would say that is a bit of a misconception there. That the East, particularly China, in those early days, now that we think that they have a different version of a divine and form. They don't. Divine was not a Chinese concept, never was, and so was the form. The early Chinese thinkers never thought about the form. These thinkers like Confucius, all these, they are only concerned with the social morality. And so the Oriental thinker has always been a mystic. They never really had gone through the route of Western, which is, in my view, rationalism. It never has been in China. And the way that Western people these days talk about the ancient thinkers, they're thinking, they romanticize. And also, they add a lot of new modern conception to add to them, as if they don't. So the ancient Chinese philosophy have its own kind of richness and idea regarding how human life should be and society, but that remain at the mystic level, like sort of at the homos level. You would say they never come to the Plato level, and that's why that yes, they have some ideas, concepts, but they never really rationalize, never really come to the same idealization that the Western has. But anyway, that's sort of kind of comments from my kind of understanding.
Well, thank you, and I think that's a good illustration of the fact that we all have different ways of approaching our understanding of time and of knowledge, and those understandings are individually driven, but they're also driven by particular societies. And so, does one society have any greater franchise on the truth than another society on this planet, or are we all, children of the same truth? So we'll go to Jane, and then maybe we'll have a chance to read that last bit as we wrap up today's session. Jane?
To answer the question that you just asked, James, well, this is just obviously my personal perspective, but I don't think that there's one civilization or country that has this one truth. And to me, it would seem that every country or civilization or any other typology that we could use, they sort of hold pieces or little shards of the truth. So, and the way that I guess I'm beginning to see what is the sort of dichotomy of being and becoming is that becoming is it's necessary, obviously. Like I think this was mentioned by many people during the discussion, for creativity and development and progress. And the reason is that it is through becoming, which is a potential way of getting at least a little hold of what is being. So that is why we need to always progress and develop, because it is only through becoming that we can get any sort of grasp upon what is being. And I also wanted to add a little bit to what Eric was saying, to continue about the daimon always saying what not to do, and how Joel mentioned that we don't know what divinity is, but we can try to find out what it's not. And it's actually interesting that Socrates never said that he knew anything. He just always said that pretty much he didn't know anything. And when he was called to be one of the wisest, or I think he was called the wisest person, the only reason he came to the conclusion after talking to all the wisest people, the only reason he came to think that he was the wisest is because he knew that he knew nothing. And I think this sort of, I guess, fits into that logic chain of well, not of events, but of facts from the Platonic world, that he never said that he knew something, but he always claimed that he did not know anything. And this is, I guess, a way of, if we try to go further into dissecting what is becoming and what is being, it would seem that becoming is not knowing and being is knowledge. So sort of knowledge is divinity, but the only way that the mortal can reach it is by trying to obtain knowledge, but being very, very humble about it. At least that's the way I saw it. And quick last note about the linear and circular perception of time. When I was doing intercultural studies, we had one of the parameters that we used to assess different cultures is actually this conception of time of linear and circular. So, for example, if we use the division of Western and Eastern cultures, a lot of the Eastern cultures lean closer to the circular perception of time rather than the linear one. And obviously, the more Western countries are closer to the linear perception of time. Thank you.
That's interesting, and I think that's a discussion that we can certainly continue. It's something that really came out to me when I read this dialogue and when I listened to that Ancient Greece Declassified podcast, because he mentions that specifically, that if time is circular, I think that really changes our perspective on a number of things, and I think that's maybe something that we need to consider. We'll just take, if it's okay, we'll take 5 minutes to wrap up here. I just wanted to read that last bit from 121C. And as I do so, I just wanted to kind of reiterate that point about epistemic responsibility that I made, and just to maybe kind of echo what Eric was saying in his last comment. I was reading, this was actually a promotion by New Scientist magazine, which I really like, a really good magazine, but they're promoting an event, and it's on AI. And their promotion for the event says, humans may not be Earth's most intelligent species for much longer. Given the rapid pace of progress in AI, many predict that AI could advance to human-level intelligence within the next several decades. From there, it could quickly outpace human intelligence. And I thought that was kind of an interesting statement, that we could build things that outpace our own intelligence. So where does this extra intelligence come from? And maybe it's this kind of, is it a misperception that these technological things that are developed are separate and apart from the intelligence that actually develops them? Are they not derivatives of the intelligence that begat them? So that was an interesting kind of comment that I just thought kind of related to this idea about, this ultimate form of intelligence that people seem to be searching for. Also, I heard in a quote by a physicist giving a podcast, he quoted Stephen Hawking, who was a great physicist, and Hawking said, if we all have a part in the final theory, if we discover a final theory of everything, quote, "Then we shall all, philosophers, scientists, and just ordinary people, be able to take part in the discussion of the question of why it is that we and the universe exist. If we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God." And, I don't know if when Hawking wrote that, he was attempting to echo Timaeus 28a, that to understand that which always is and never becomes, in other words, the being that Jane was just talking about, you need that reasoned account. But I wanted to end by this quote from 121c of Critias. And this is the ending of the dialogue. "But as Zeus, god of the gods, reigning as king according to law, could clearly see the state of affairs," and he's talking about the state of affairs in Atlantis, this decay that somebody had mentioned earlier. "He observed this noble race lying in this abject state and resolved to punish them and to make them more careful and harmonious as a result of their chastisement." And I wanted to highlight that word harmonious. "To this end, he called all the gods to their most honored abode, which stands at the middle of the universe and looks down upon all that has a share in generation. And when he gathered them together, he said," and so we end the dialogue. And so I just wanted us to reflect on that ending, to kind of think, well, do we have sufficient harmony to understand what the divine being has said? Is this something that we can write down in stone? If we understood what the divine being said, would we write it down in stone, and would we make all future generations adhere to this? Powerful thought. So I just wanted to leave people with that idea as we wrap up another discussion. It's been an absolutely great discussion, and I wanted to thank all the new and returning participants to today. And I'm looking forward to our next discussion on Euthyphro, which is going to pick up on this idea of the divine and the word of the divine. So we'll do that in 2 weeks. So I will pass it over to Eva to wrap up today's recording.
Thank you, James. Thank you for joining, friends. As inspiring as it gets, this is another discussion that we don't want to leave, as usual. We believe Plato, Aflatun would be proud of all these reasonings. We'll be adding an unrecorded part, Plato's Cafe, starting next episode. Please follow up with that on future meetup posts. We meet through Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, and Online Rebels. James, thank you for leading and preparing all this. Thank you for giving us the chance to share and ask our questions. I'm Eva Alice. This was Plato's Pot. Until next episode, friends. So long.